Welcome everybody, mate. We got a little bit of an audio problem there. We had some of that boomer tech at the beginning, baby. Got that boomer tech.
I also host my own podcast called The Council of Trent, and if you're Catholic, you'll get the pun, or at least if you're well-educated, you'll get the pun. COUNSEL, of course. If you want to check that out, you can see it on iTunes, Council of Trent, where you can support. So in this debate, I want to ask 9 yes-no questions, and then show that the answers to those questions lead to a cause of the universe that has the traditional divine attributes, or what most people call God. So let's get started. Number 1, does the universe have an explanation for its existence? We know some objects in the universe are contingent, or their existence must be explained by something else. This debate exists because of computers and internet connections. We pray stay up. The devices you watch it on exist because of factories and power sources. All of these things are contingent, or they don't explain their own existence. Instead, they must be explained by something else. So how do we explain them? One way would be to posit an infinite chain of contingent things explaining each other. But that doesn't explain why the whole series of things exists any more than an infinitely long chain could explain how a chandelier is hanging above my head.
So this is the typical mistake of beginning your argument with a causal chain or a causation type of argument. Now, if we lived in the ancient medieval world and people generally accepted those kinds of principles operant in the world, it would make sense that the ancient and medieval philosophers didn't challenge the opponents at the presuppositional level. They had not yet experienced the Occam period, the nominalist period, the Enlightenment and scientific revolution period, which led to the questioning of those very things in the external world. So while this is what I think a lot of people find very confusing about what we say in terms of being a presuppositional apologist, it's not that we are literally saying there's no such thing as causation and teleology in the world. It's rather to say that the people that you're arguing against, skeptics, now I haven't heard CosmicSkeptic's position yet, but again, remember, what did we say to Matt Dillahunty? What do we say to Sam Harris, right? These skeptic types don't read and are not aware of David Hume. And the problem is that it doesn't appear that the Thomists and the classical theists, the classical foundationalists, etc., have ever read David Hume either, because they're never addressing his objections. The point is not to appeal to David Hume as an authority, right? This is another low IQ misunderstanding. The point is to appeal to the argument that David Hume makes about critiquing the peripatetic axiom, critiquing self-evident maxims, right? Critiquing the idea that there are neutral, theory-laden, value-neutral, causal, epistemic, metaphysical categories in truth that are just self-evident. They don't come as part of any worldview. And so we all just can appeal to those things, and if we all just think right, we'll all come to the right conclusions. But that's not the Christian view of how paradigms and truths and arguments and logic work, right? Logic is not a neutral thing, right, that doesn't come as part of a paradigm. It doesn't come as part of a theory. It does. That's the point, right? So already from the outset, we're going to have the same critique of Trent that I have of Ed Feser, right? I did a whole critique of Dr. Ed Feser's book, 5 Proofs. One of those proofs, one of those chapters is Principle of Sufficient Reason, and then another chapter on causation, where he tries to make a causal kind of a structured causal argument, not a causal chain argument, because according to Feser, he doesn't even think we can make those or that are even that worthwhile anymore. And in fact, he has no problem, he says, with his argument, his causal argument, proving an eternal creation, right? Because if God is defined or explained as the eternal actualizer, as the classical Aristotelian causal argument says, then God has to have something to eternally actualize, or else the word eternal actualizer, first actualizer, that has no meaning. So then, as Basil says in his second homily of the Hexameron, now you get a dyad because the eternal actualizer has to be actualizing something other than himself, something outside of himself. And that other, that outside, that prima materia, that celestial spheres, the external world, whatever you want to define it as other than the first actualizer, has to also be eternal. It's eternally actualized. It's eternally moved, right? And that is because, well, for many reasons. For one, the eternal actualizer does not have any potentia. And this is not even really controversial. There's no potentia in the first being, the first cause, right? He actualizes at all times and everything that it wills to actualize, or whatever, however you want to phrase that, right? Of course, Aristotle didn't think of God as a he. Aristotle thought of God as an impersonal force in it, thought, thinking itself. Right? That's different than the Christian conception of God. So already from the outset, we're going to see that they're missing the boat when it comes to how you argue for the God presented in the Bible. St. Gregory Palamas says that God is not an it. Right? He says in the Triads, in Exodus 3, Moses didn't say it, right? I am the supreme it, right? He said, I am he, right? I am the one who is, who being personal, right? So this distinguishes biblical revelation in terms of God being personal from the impersonalism, the abstract essentialism of Hellenic thought and pagan thought. So we have here just this basically restatement of versions of the cosmological causal types of arguments. And these arguments just simply don't work because they don't prove and demonstrate what they're setting out to prove unless you have Christian presuppositions. But that's the thing in question, right? So if I'm a Christian and I believe that the cosmological argument proves the Christian God, it's because of my Christian presuppositions that I read it that way, right? But there's nothing about an infinite causal chain or a finite causal chain or a first cause or multiple first causes, right? Aristotle himself contradicts on this point because at some points he says there's one first cause, and other times he says the first cause is many. Which is it, right? And wouldn't that undercut the argument for the first cause or a God if we're admitting that maybe multiple first causes are involved in the beginning of the universe, the beginning of things? Of course it does. The Bible does not teach eternal creation. That's fundamentally different and rejected by biblical Orthodox Christianity. That's Origenism. That's a version of Platonism. It's what you find in Aristotle. It's what you find in Freemasonry, right? All of those non-Christian groups teach that creation is an eternal generation, eternal actualized external reality to the one, etc., etc. So if our argument is basically proving the same type of God that Masonry proves, that another world religion proves, these are not good arguments.
Wrong.
They're worthless arguments, really. They only work in that way if you reformulate them as a transcendental version of a cosmological argument or a transcendental version of some metaphysical teleological argument, right? Because if we're going to start with sense data, right, and that's what this philosophy, this theology does. Thomas Aquinas says there's nothing in the intellect that is not first in the senses. That's called the peripatetic axiom. It's directly from Aristotle. So that's the beginning of all Thomistic epistemology. That's the beginning of Roman Catholic epistemology. Roman Catholicism has adopted, roughly speaking, the epistemology of Aquinas and the peripatetic axiom. So if we're at that point, then what we're arguing for is going to end up being an eternally moving actualizer, right? A first being that needs an eternal creation to define himself, to define his action and his movement, and that's not Christianity. Again, Basil has a whole homily talking about how dumb this is, right? When he critiques Aristotle, he says, this idiot, Aristotle, posited a dyad because he posited an eternal first mover and then the eternal thing that the first mover moves, prima materia. That is not ex nihilo creation. You have to believe in ex nihilo creation to be a Christian. Because if you don't, you're a pagan, right? If you don't believe in ex nihilo creation, you're admitting that there's something other than God that's eternal. And not just eternal, it's as necessary as God, because God is defined by the thing that he creates. And that's another reason why actus purus, right, which is the Thomistic scholastic doctrine, the Roman Catholic doctrine, that there is absolutely no active or passive potentia in God at all. He is the purely actualized actualizer. And that means that anything that is potentia must be actualized. Right? And how did we critique Phaser on that point? Oh, really? Then God must actualize all possible worlds, because Phaser has a whole chapter where he argues for possible worlds in God. Right? The Christian theology, Thomism, can talk about possible worlds. That means potentia. But you just told me that there is no potentia in God. Right? And then we had other critiques as well relating to the fact that the way that God is described in terms of simplicity by Phaser in multiple chapters precludes the incarnation. Right? He says that God can't enter into time and space. He's eternal, unchanging, and if he entered into time and space, he would change. Time and space would affect him. And that would not be God, because God is unchanging and can't be affected by time and space. Really? You sure you want to go that route? Because Dr. Bradshaw has a great chapter where he critiques this argument, or the concept of the divine energies and on the divine glory, 2 chapters, in 2 essays, 2 papers, where he says that doesn't the Bible say God hears our prayers? Yeah, exactly. So this idea that God can't interact with the world, right? He has no direct relation to the world. And the idea that his simplicity precludes him stepping into time and space, that is not Christian theology. You're doing Platonism. That's Platonic philosophy and theology, because we believe that God stepped into time and space, you see. So how are you going to divorce your Christology from your apologetic? How are you going to divorce your Christology from your epistemology? How are you going to divorce your Christology from your metaphysic? You can't, right? Because our theology, if you read St. Maximus, what does he do? He says the logi is the meaning of the natural world. Can Thomas Aquinas say that Christ is the meaning of the natural world? Not really, right? I mean, he may say that in a sense, but it's not consistent. That's the point, right? We're not saying that Thomas never says consistent or correct things, but that he never says correct things, but that he's not consistent is the point. And almost always across the board, the arguments are, you don't understand Aquinas. It's not that difficult to understand these causal chain arguments, or to understand the structured causal argument that Phaser makes. And again, in about 5 or 10 places in the book, Phaser admits that he's not concerned about an eternal creation. He recognizes that the argument, as he's formulated it, admits that creation is eternal. That is not the Christian God. That's a worthless apologetic. Why are we arguing for Aristotle's thought thinking? So why are we arguing for the kind of God that's heterodox? Why are we arguing for Freemasonry's God? Right? These are terrible arguments.
G'day, and welcome to Pints with Aquinas. My name is Matt Brad.
Oh, yeah, is that your name?
First debate we're hosting.
Oh, that's great, mate. I saw your channel was called Matt Fred. I wasn't sure if that was actually your name, mate.